Hello.
Hello.
Thank you guys for coming. This is great to have you here. And it's really fun to be in Salem. So thank you for letting me come to Salem and talk with you guys about some of the work we've been doing around the country with the members of the coalition. And I'll share with you a little bit about who we are as the coalition, what this big project is that we've been making happen, and then we are going to dive into one of the models and start talking a little bit about what's going on with immigration in the world right now. And then we can finish up with a little bit what we've learned from having these conversations around the country. So yeah, let me start though with a video for you guys.
Struggles for liberation, for civil rights, justice, peace. Can we use the memory of these events to improve our world today and create a better tomorrow? The International Coalition of Sites of Conscience is a worldwide network dedicated to the belief that by remembering the struggles of the past, we can question our current reality and create meaningful change for the future. Sites of Conscience are memorials to moments of deep human significance, to suffering and struggle, tragedy and triumph, and the all-enduring strength of the human spirit. But they don't just teach us about the past. Sites of Conscience touch us and transform us. They help us to see our shared goals and our shared responsibilities. Comprised of sites in countries around the globe, the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience helps places of memory become places of action around today's issues: discrimination, intolerance, xenophobia, genocide. At the heart of the Sites of Conscience movement are creative and pioneering projects that bring people together to learn and talk more openly about past and how we might shape a more just future. In South Africa, an apartheid-era prison now hosts the country's constitutional court, and in a place where justice was once denied, invites visitors to debate what justice means today. Through a traveling museum in Bangladesh, genocide survivors bring the little-known history of the country's struggle for independence to children in remote villages, asking them to envision how they will build a nation based on human rights and democracy. And in Argentina, an organization remembering those who disappeared during the military dictatorships is using memory to foster accountability and prevent all forms of state terrorism. Across the globe, Sites of Conscience initiatives engage young and old together to unpack our past, shape our future, and help us move from memory to action. To get involved, go to sitesofconscience.org.
So that's who we are. We're sites, places of memory, museums, organizations around the world who want to create more justice, who want to create more democracy, and want to do it through these places, through the power of space, through the power of place. From our founders, as they wrote about it. The idea that for these places, engaging with current tragedies, preventing the next tragedy, that's not something we do on the side. It's not something we do every once in a while. That is fundamental to who these institutions are and the role they are going to play in society. Taking on pressing social issues and taking them on in ways that engage our visitors and move them to action. It's not enough to just tell about these problems. We want to start helping people create solutions as well. So we have now about 200 members around the world in 55 countries. And in the United States, a lot of them started to come together, talking to each other around ideas around immigration. And what they were saying to each other is, I don't know if anybody else is working on this. I don't know how we can exactly work together, but we each feel the need to take this on, and it is big and it is scary, and we know that when we step out to take this on, we want some other people with us. We want to see how we can help each other. Let's try and figure out a little bit better how to do this together. And when they came together to have these conversations, what they found is there actually was some pretty big overlap between the different institutions, and things that they thought were unique to their communities actually turned out to be national pieces. And some of the big stuff that they found resonance on was that this is in around 2007. The national dialogue was vitriolic. The conversation did not speak well of the democracy. It was harsh, it was extreme, it was polarizing, and it involved a lot of yelling and not much actual conversation. And so that was something that they saw, hey, we want to change that piece of it. They also found across the country, it was undemocratic. It was not encouraging democratic solutions. It was not encouraging participation in the democratic process. It was also one that often the conversation led to the exclusion of people from the democracy. They wanted to change that too. And so sort of finding these as unifying pieces of interest amongst all these sites, they said, all right, let's work together on this. Let's start to do this. So this started a long process of conversations amongst the sites, work with scholars around the country on this, but also crucially work with local community partners who are tackling immigration in other ways, expanding how the museums saw themselves in their communities and how they approached immigration in their communities. And some other pieces started to happen as they were going on this journey. They started to they realized that there were holes in who was talking about this in terms of museums. It was the places like Ellis Island that you expect to have conversations about immigration, and that meant voices were missing. So they opened the conversation to more of the US sites, and we started to get places, yes, like you would imagine, like Ellis Island, like the National Hispanic Cultural Center. But they also started to get the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, the Pauli Murray Project, places that more aligned with civil rights conversations in the United States than they are typically with immigration conversations. But part of the growth process internally for these institutions was to say, hey, this is a civil rights conversation as well. This is a human rights conversation. And so we have a place in this. They started to expand the range of places that were appropriate places to have this conversation. And when they were doing some research, evaluation of their audiences and who might be interested in this and where they might fit in this, they found some interesting things. What they found is that most people, as much as immigration was splashed across the headlines every day, dominating discourse in the country, people were not actually having conversations about immigration with strangers, with people outside of their immediate family or friend circle. So yeah, they talk about it, but not with anybody in the broader world. There were no larger conversations that they were having. And so that's where the museum started to see themselves fit in. To start to say, okay, we don't like how the discourse is happening, and we also don't like the lack of space for this. So that's what we can start to do. The country doesn't necessarily need somebody else telling people what immigration policy should be. The country needs places for citizens to come together and figure out what those immigration policies should be, figure out what our values should be in the country. So let's start to reorient from being places that tell people how to think to being places that encourage that debate, encourage that conversation, and allow people to understand how to think together with other citizens. as one of the folks said, one of their realizations from this, as a result of doing the dialogues, I learned something about our community that no one else is doing dialogues. There isn't a place for this to happen. And if our most pressing social issues are ones that we cannot talk about with other people in society, that's a problem for a democracy. That's not a good thing. That's not a healthy thing. And so a lot of this work became, for the sites, became about having productive immigration conversations, and it became about strengthening the American democracy through that, by encouraging the kind of civic interaction and exchange that we want to see on big, contentious, hot issues like this. So this is what they came up with in the end. This is what they agreed to each other. And you can see it's not about making people think a particular way. It's about creating spaces that people can come and have a particular kind of experience around this. And that the community who's connected to each of these museums, which is going to be a different community in California than it is in Texas, than it is in New York, are going to be able to start to have that conversation. So that was the idea behind this project. Let's start creating these spaces. And it ended up producing a few different pieces that came out of it. 20 institutions across the country then started to host dialogues on immigration. And each one looked different. But they shared their models, they shared their methods for doing this, they shared with each other what went well, what didn't go well, the lessons they were learning. And so we started reaching people across the country with these conversations. Produced a website for it. You can go there later on. You can see the different program models. There's resources, historical resources for framing immigration in the country, programmatic resources for how to have these kinds of conversations. I can tell you more about the outcomes in a little bit. But how does this start to strike you guys? Is this questions about anything I've said so far with this? Great. Then before I've talked too long, what I'd like to do is I'd like to shut this off and let's do one of these models. We're going to take a look at the, if people are willing to do that, yes? You want to have this conversation? Great. Let's go to Ellis Island. I do not have the power to magically move you there right now. But for a moment, in your mind, let's go to Ellis Island. Has anybody ever been to Ellis? A lot of folks. Great. Wonderful. So Ellis Island, one of the main points of entry, sort of the iconic point of entry to the United States, a place where many people had powerful experiences of coming to the United States, being allowed in, not being allowed in, where our debates about who we are as Americans and what the country's policies are going to be really played out in person there. So Ellis Island's program would start with a tour of the island. This is what it looks like today. You would see things like the big pile of luggage that's so iconic from there, where immigrants would come and their baggage would be piled up as they were examined. That would happen up in this hall here. Here it is today, in use in the past, full of people. And that's where they're asking you questions. Are you an anarchist? Figuring out, is this somebody who's going to be allowed into the United States or not? So they would do so they'd go on a tour, and then afterwards, they'd start talking with each other. All right, so it gives you a sense of Ellis, which is great. Let's we'll leave that up if you need to be reminded of where you are. But the first thing that we could do, I invite you to do, is maybe we're going to be in a whole big group, but to start, maybe kind of you guys can talk for a second, and you guys can talk for a second. Turn to the folks around you, introduce yourself, and as you talk to each other, I'd love you to consider the question, and if people want to make a little group in the middle, that's fine. I'd love you to consider the question, when people ask you where you're from, how do you answer and why? So did that come up for anybody else, this idea of saying, well, it depends? How else did that start to depend for people, the way you answer? What started to shape the ways you answer that?
I had brought up it depends on where you are. If you're traveling and you'd say I'm from the U.S., from the United States, depending on the group, you might even have to define that better. Well, if you said, I guess I got that wrong, because I was going to say in some groups you'd have to identify the United States rather than Canada or someplace like that. If you said that from America, you'd have to define it as the United States. And then again, if you were in a smaller group, you could say where you live or where you used to live. Some of those two times, so it really does depend.
It also depends on who's asking.
Yeah. Tell me more about that.
Well, so I think if someone is just meeting you briefly and what you sort of perceive they want for an answer, it could be on your sound. Then going a little deeper, it could be, well, I was born in Portugal, lived in Germany, came to the States, and a deeper issue, deeper answer. You were trying to say sometimes they're trying to peg your race, right? So, and that might be the answer they're looking for to sort of categorize you, and it's a different answer.
I was sharing that I work with high school students and a lot of English language learners and immigrant students, and sometimes they ask, "Where are you from?" And I say New York, because that's where I grew up. And they say, "No, where are you from?" And really, the question is like, "Are you white?"
Yeah.
But it's as if the kids have this unspoken code that I can't ask you what your race is, so I'm going to ask you where you're from, but I'm really asking you something different. I'm not asking you to geographically identify yourself.
What are you?
Right, but some of the kids,
What's your ethnic background? Yeah.
And what does that mean? I'm a woman.
But I think too, for like times I've traveled, to go back to your point, where people have said, where are you from? And if I'm in Europe, the automatic answer is, oh, I'm American. But if people ask that here, like not necessarily where are you from, but I kind of almost take that sometimes it's like, oh, what's your background? And then going into like, oh yeah, I'm this, and this, and telling people that, but not necessarily saying off the bat like, oh, I'm American. Like it almost seems when you ask that question within the 50 states, you're not really asking, are you Americans? Not always clear that you're American, but it's kind of a point that you might be.
My sister adopted 2 children, and so she has the same heritage as me, but the children do not. And so as a flip side to this, people will ask her, where are the kids from? And she'll say, Cambridge, Massachusetts, knowing where they're from. And it's really become a real personal issue for her because, she, like you were saying, she doesn't really feel, especially if she doesn't know the person, that she needs to identify.
So it's really interesting the way you guys are pulling out the different levels of meaning to this particular question, right? Sometimes it's, well, they want to know geographically where you're from. Sometimes you feel like they're actually loading a lot more context onto it, and sort of audience matters a lot. So I'm wondering, here in Salem, how does that question get used here in Salem? What are the different meanings that question starts to carry in Salem? What are people really trying to find out when they ask that question in Salem, Massachusetts?
Which street?
Yeah.
Tell me more about that.
Well, it's a neighborhood.
Which street?
What street? Yeah, there's. I think there's sort of neighborhood classism sometimes enters into where we're from if it's a local question.
I think one question for people who white bread people like me is there are people who were born and bred here, and if you were not born and bred here, you're not really from
Right.
Salem.
Amen.
Yeah, you're going to find out you have 30 years, right?
When people ask me, when I'm talking with somebody, they say, if they're from Salem, I say, what part?
What part?
Right. Mm-hmm. Yep. North Salem, South Salem.
And so what does that tell you? What does that start to tell you?
About me?
No, what does that start to tell you when you ask, what part? What does that start to tell you?
Well, they want to know if you live near your
different
neighborhood.
Okay.
And
But
I
then
think
it gets into, oh, well, you must know so-and-so or so-and-so because of these families that have lived here for generations. And so-
But think of the immigrant populations. If you're from Castle Hill, you're
Yeah.
probably French Canadian.
Yeah.
If you're in one area, you might be Polish. Another, if you live in the Point, you're probably Hispanic. Yeah, so that I think people do associate neighborhoods with different immigrant populations.
That's starting to be, that's, for the most part, I would say, except with the exception of the Point neighborhood.
It's dissipating.
It's dissipating, you know, because this whole neighborhood used to be Polish and Russian, and it's not anymore. You know, it's,
So is it fading for all groups? Or is it fading for some groups?
It's fading for white groups.
For some groups, but I think that I was jolted to reality by a Russian lady who wanted to know why we had all these foreign language brochures and not Russian out there in the lobby. And I said, well, no, I do understand that in the German century this was Russian, Polish neighborhood. But what we've been told and what I read is that the Russian generations have been mainstream now. They mostly speak English. They do not have need of Russian language materials. She said they told you wrong. And we're all essentially, she is a senior citizen who visited the Gables, fell in love with it, and wants to see everything translated to Russian. She says we're all in assisted living facilities in Swamska, Marblehead, all around the North Shore, but we want Russian. That's interesting, you know? So you think that the melting pot and the mainstreaming, but then there's someone who comes along and tells you we're pretty strong, actually. We're a group of people to whom Russian matters a lot.
Did she say if she was first generation or?
She is, yeah, she said she was born actually, first generation I understand to be born here, but she's Russian originally.
You were asking the question about things sort of like evening out between the different, I'll use the term ghettos. If you go back 40 or 60 years ago, every section of Salem was a ghetto. You had the Polish ghetto, you had the Russian part up here, you had the Italian ghetto, the Irish ghetto, the French ghetto. You had one in Castle Hill and one at the Point. And the mixing of the population occurred along Lafayette Street, except for where you had the English, which they were on their own there. And I remember as a child here that it was very much set up that way. People really didn't associate all the time with people from the other ghettos. Just didn't.
So what set it up that way? Who set it up? Were there laws? Were there...
No, there were people being brought in to work in the mills and things of that nature. It all depends on where they came from at that particular time. And they had lots of people come from one area, so those people would sort of like get together and stay in the same area.
What are the forces?
It's just like what happened at the Point. The Point is Spanish-speaking people. I don't use the term as Hispanic, because Hispanic comes from Hispaniola. Very few people that come from Hispaniola. But the Spanish people, replaced the French people. But they were brought in. They came in for different reasons, but they came in and grabbed that area.
So you're talking about barriers breaking down, some barriers staying up. What are the forces in Salem that are breaking these barriers down, and what are the forces that are keeping some barriers up still?
I think that the older immigrant, if they're not working, they have, so it's harder to learn the language, and if they're not working anymore, they have less motivation, maybe, to learn. But, and they have, maybe they live with their grown children, so, that answers what you're saying.
How do other people
I
see
think
it?
intermarriages have changed a lot of things. Changes in religious views changed a lot of things. And education changed a lot of things.
Is
In my
that,
opinion.
Is that a good thing? Is it good when you were talking about mainstreaming? Is that a good thing for Salem if everybody who comes to Salem eventually just becomes part of the mainstream? Is that a good future for Salem?
To some extent, yes. I mean, so that everybody has the same opportunities. But you'd like to think that they'd be able to keep some of their own culture and, you know, the best parts of each culture, but at the same time have the same opportunities.
Which is usually the food.
Food, music.
I think it's a problem if people come in groups and don't assimilate. Like, I think the Spanish people should talk English more. I try to speak Spanish more, as much as I can. However, if they don't assimilate, like in Berlin, you have the Arabs don't seem to assimilate with anyone else, near the group. I think that's a problem, because what is America? America is a group of people that work together. And if you make yourself into a ghetto where you have no assimilation, no moving into the other areas, it's not part of this country.
Is this where that perception comes from for you? That the Arab community is particularly isolated?
Well, they're more isolated, in my opinion, than the Spanish-speaking people are. Because you have some Spanish-speaking people who mix, and you have others who don't. And there are sections of Salem that now speak only Spanish. Not only, but mostly Spanish. I mean, you can go into Market Basket, and I love it. They talk Spanish.
Is this similar, different than other people's experiences in Salem around this?
I think it depends. I mean, the assimilation question takes time, and I think it's how recent the immigrant population is. I can only speak from my experience, right? So we came over from Portugal, and you want to be surrounded with people that understand your culture and understand the food and can help you out, fill out a form, application form, doctor's form, whatever. So you form ghettos or clusters of people that are like you, right? And then you start to become exposed in the environment that you're in over time. You know, your kids go to school. You're forced to sort of interact more. But your comfort zone is always the people that are like you.
I think, having lived in Miami for 47 years, the contrast between down there and up here, people seem more integrated here. Miami is completely Hispanic as far as anything. Everything is published in both languages. A lot of people have never even learned English. There's all kinds of jokes down in Miami. But the last American bring the American flag. I mean, there's all kinds of hostile jokes about that. But Miami is very completely Hispanic. It's 80% Hispanic. And up here, if there are these cultural conclaves, it's not as predominant as it is down there. But I think culturally, this country has gone from being the melting pot to the salad bowl. That's what they talk about now, the salad bowl, where everybody keeps their culture and so on. And in my parents' generation, the whole goal was to be assimilated and to leave the old language, the old customs behind. And then people started missing that. And I think in the present age, we're seeing more maintaining cultural activities and language and so on. My parents didn't allow us to learn their language. And so I think it is changing, and I think it also varies in different areas of the country. certain cultures predominate in different areas. New England is an area where, if you want to say foreign cultures don't dominate, whereas in an area like Miami, South Florida, foreign cultures can dominate.
So interesting ideas in there. This are there parts of Salem that are more American than other parts? Are some of those neighborhoods in Salem more American or less American based on what happens there?
Probably based on class,
Tell
based
me
on
more.
wealth.
What do you mean?
So
Tell me more about that. Tell me more
I
what you
was
mean.
just, because I live in a neighborhood that it's, you know, wealthy homes, so you're not gonna have people that just immigrated here. Most don't have the funds to purchase a condo in those areas or a home.
I guess it depends on what do you mean by American, right? So I mean, I don't know. I'm having a hard time with when we talk about culture, how are we defining that? Or what is American culture? If it's truly what you're referring to, that this is a country built on immigrants, then what is more American than an immigrant community coming to the country? So I don't know, are there places more American? And I also don't feel like I can speak to Salem because I don't live here and I'm not from here. I do think that any pocket of Salem can be as American as how you define American to be.
I think I was asking that question in part because I think there probably are different definitions. So tell me a little bit more about how you would define for you what's the root of being American.
I don't know that there's a singular answer to that, right? So I think about, like, we're coming towards Columbus Day, and a lot of people talk about America starting with Columbus, where actually we know that the country, and wasn't within a country, existed far before that. You think about the building of America, the starting, it really started in this colonial way. And so I don't know if you can take a negative view and say to be American is to be, you know, an imperialist, or you could say to be American in a really positive way is to be proud and democratic and work towards social justice. I don't know that there's a singular answer to that. And it's probably, all of us interpret that in a different way.
And especially, well, first of all, I don't like to use the term American. I use the term Musanian. And if you use the Spanish, it's estadounidense. Canadian. What do you say? Canadian? Canadiense. So I always use Usanian when I write. And I think, especially because the United States is so vast, it's easier to talk about New Englanders. New Englanders have sort of a characteristic as opposed to Southerners, as opposed to Midwesterners. And it's easier to define those Usanians by their regions, I think, if you're going to talk. And so the dominant culture might be New Englanders, and you know, those stoic ones who fight the winter all the time and say, you guys are sissies when you close schools when there's only 5 feet of snow, you know, right?
There's a character.
And you know, and it's not everybody, but the immigrants get into it in a way, you know, because they have to. They have to adapt in some ways, and they pick up that sense of culture, but they still maintain themselves because it's a comfort level. I mean, I go to Chinese restaurants with my Chinese friends, and they're speaking Chinese the whole time, and I get a real sense of what it is to be an immigrant in this country and have no clue what's going on around you. You know, and I teach ESL, so I sort of know what the kids are dealing with, and it's always a good refresher to have that sense. But there is an assimilation to a degree of a culture, but not total culture.
I think the happiest moment recently for me with regard to this immigration topic came when I was stopping at the Bentley School and I met a little girl, and the principal identified her as Nora Lopez Talent. That's great. She understands in Spanish. She was not, I think she's born here, but the Spanish, one parent is Spanish speaking. And I think when someone said earlier, intermarriage, you know, one thing that strikes me about marriage is that I think it's just observational, a higher percentage of families that are multiracial, multi-ethnic than any place I've seen. We started to see it in Chicago when I was growing up, between the Czech neighborhood and the Mexican neighborhood, that you began to see that happen.
And the Jewish
In the Jewish
We lived in the same neighborhood at the same time but didn't know it.
So I think that to me is very American, when someone has that kind of name and that kind of identity. And the most distressing part is when I do see one conversation I'm dying to have, and maybe we'll have it next year, is the conversation between the old immigrants of Salem, the French Canadian and the Poles, and the Latino immigrants, because I do sense that the time span of the new generation, let's say 5th generation or 6th generation, they believe that their ancestors assimilated or were integrated much faster than they really were.
You're
I think
absolutely
there
correct.
were
It took a couple generations for sure.
And
yeah,
Well,
and
I
I
think
that's where-
too, for some of them.
I personally, feel that the perception or the recollection is that the previous generations did assimilate more, and they expect the new generations to be able to do it overnight. And, it takes a while to become fluent, verbally, and then to be able to learn to read and write is even, more difficult and more time consuming.
And it wasn't
it can't, even with instruction, so
yeah, it wasn't very tolerant then either, if you didn't assimilate quickly, right?
Right.
So even just going to a grocery store or a shop to buy something, you would get treated differently. It's much more accepting now and much more and chic to be ethnic.
And I know my great-grandparents moved around quite a bit. They settled originally in New York and the Bronx and went to upstate New York and eventually in western Massachusetts. But every place they lived in was a Lithuanian neighborhood. They never moved out of the Lithuanian neighborhood in any place that they were, because it was always the church, the stores, the social clubs. And it was, I think very similar to like a Derby Street style neighborhood, where it was people who spoke the language, people who, had similar beliefs, similar traditions to them, that every single place where they lived, it was always surrounded by the same kind of people.
Well, and I also just wonder about employment and the ability to assimilate. I'm speaking of my husband's grandparents, and when they came over, Nana and Pa did not speak English, and Nana, when I married into the family, was really pretty broken. A small amount of English was spoken, but yet her husband was able to be fully employed by Stanley Tool, and there was a whole community in amongst the workers at Stanley Tool that their primary language was Assyrian. And that manufacturing type of work is changing so much that I don't know how Nana and Pa's assimilation would be today.
We talk about participation. You were there at the Tabernacle Church. We were talking about, in effect, what it means to be Latino in Salem, and we were talking about your ability to participate if you don't speak the language. And I was so impressed by talking about parents wanting to be involved in their children's lives, but how do you even find out what the soccer schedule is if you don't understand English? How do you know about teacher night if you don't understand English? And it goes far beyond the schools, but that's the part that really stuck with me, is not just assimilation from the perspective of the community, but when you feel that you belong, when you feel you can participate. And language is part of that.
So,
Don't you? I'm sorry.
no, go ahead.
Don't you feel that in this country right now, and here in Salem and all the way around this area, that everyone's trying much more to help people who do not speak English? I mean, when I was a kid, my first language was French. I spoke only French. And I grew up in this city. And I know that no one tried to teach me English. Everyone expected me to speak English. So, I got to be a certain age, I learned English, and I spoke English from that time
Did your
on.
parents learn English?
My parents were born here, and they spoke English.
Mm.
But I had a grandfather who would give us money if we would speak only French.
Truth comes out.
So we never spoke French in the house because it paid.
We all speak money.
Tips all the time.
So this is, as our time here starts to come to an end, you guys are heading in just a myriad of fruitful directions. This idea of the way the changing American economy influences the lives of immigrants. You're talking about the conversations between different waves of immigrants from different parts of the world, different kinds of experiences. So as our moment right now comes to an end, take a moment, think, and then toss out, who would you like to continue this conversation with? Right? And what more would you like to talk about? How should this conversation about immigration in Salem continue? What should it continue to be talking about? And who should it continue with? Who needs to be part of it?
Well, the newest immigrant families need to be part of the conversation.
And I believe that many of them want to be part of the conversation, but I think we will fare better if we have the conversation be in Spanish, with translations to English, because that's where they are.
Mm-hmm.
And they want to communicate, but so much of our work is really, even in the schools, English translated to Spanish, and something extra has to happen there, because we Latinos are 17% of the Salem population, and I think that we're going to have to bridge the gap somehow, but we really need more people in the schools who speak Spanish in positions of power and authority. Many parents tell us that they do not feel comfortable in the schools, despite the best efforts of teachers and some administrators. There are less than 4% of, and correct me if I'm wrong, Rebecca, but a very tiny percentage of staff and administrators in Salem Public Schools are Latino or any other ethnic group.
This is,
But
I'm
the new
hearing.
superintendent is.
Being an immigrant myself, when I learned English in Peabody, there weren't people that spoke Portuguese in the school system. Actually, it's better that you don't have people that speak your language, because it forces you to have to speak American.
So what I'm hearing right now is there's another great conversation to be had about accommodations and the use of language in different spaces and where it's appropriate. It's come up a number of times here. What is the best way to have folks move to the country? What kind of accommodations should be made, right? We're hearing really different values about that and really different hopes for that. So I think that would be another great conversation to have. Anything else? Who else should be part of this? Other topics that we really should be talking about here?
Certainly the teachers.
Teachers.
What about teachers?
Pardon?
What about teachers? Tell me more about that.
The teachers need to be so aware of the different ethnicities that we have represented, and that we can accommodate and welcome those. I know when I was teaching, I used to have the kids do their heritage study, my heritage for each kid, and they did reports on it and so forth. And that was very rich for all of us, because the kids learned to appreciate their culture, and the parents liked being represented. They would bring in photographs and albums and things like that.
I think that that's a way that we can, you know,
Great.
respect various cultures.
I think another thing is, you're talking about the schools, is starting children at an early age, kindergarten, in languages, because it's so easy for these kids to pick up a language when they're 4 or 5 years old, and by the time you're 14 or so in high school and all, forget it, you know. And I think that if we taught different languages, French, Spanish, whatever, in the schools, and also English for the new children who need to learn English, but offer our kids other languages, and I think that would be very helpful too. I lived in Europe for a short time, and oh my God, they all are fluent in like 4 or 5 languages.
So the way this is going to happen is that you guys are the ones who can teach me this conversation. If you think these are topics that we should be talking about, if you think these are important things to be figured out in Salem, you have the opportunity every day to try and create those spaces or work with a couple of the really good organizations in the room who are trying to create those spaces. So I'd invite you to continue this topic with people who are of interest to you and on topics of interest to you. So thank you guys so much for sharing your stories, your observations, your knowledge. This has been really cool to hear this, and I feel like I know Salem much better than when I walked in the door. If it's all right with you, let's go back to the screen, unless anybody has any comments right now. Yeah, we're going to go back, and I'm going to share with you the way Ellis would do this at Ellis, and then a few other sites around the country. But you had a thought, yeah?
A real quick thought
Yeah.
is, if anyone goes to another part of the country, experience a different culture, yeah, but if you go out of the country where it's a different language, temporarily you're in an environment that the people, the newcomers here are experiencing. But a lot of us, we know it's hard for people, but we don't have, a lot of people don't taking any action to get involved, but we're aware of the issues.
Very cool.
That's what I'd say.
Cool. Yeah, that we all have the opportunity to experience these when we travel. Let's take a look back, if you can get that back on. I want to share with you the way some of these conversations look a little bit different at different sites in the country, and also some of the lessons that we've learned of doing some of this work. So what Ellis ends up talking about, and I think it comes out more there because you're at Ellis Island, is they start talking more about the laws, right? They're a place of laws. They're a place influenced primarily by rules, regulations, and laws, and so they become a place that talks really about the legality of immigration, and that's very often where those conversations go. There are some questions on paper around the room. We didn't get to them. You guys didn't need to go to those. They ask you questions like, should English be the official language of the United States? Should people with infectious disease be allowed to emigrate to the United States? Should people, undocumented immigrants to the United States, be granted amnesty? And then they ask for your response on those kinds of questions in different ways. So they start to really look at policies there. Rooted in Ellis, they have policy conversations. I'm going to show you, just to give you a sense of how these conversations really do feel different in different places. Levine Museum of the New South, and this is, when we said before, this could be an interesting one for you guys to think about there, because issues of migration aren't always folks coming from Central and South America into communities. There's lots of other ways that migration plays out in the United States. And so Levine's took an exhibit. They had called From Cotton Fields to Skyscrapers, looking at African American migration in the past and using that as their grounding point to talk about different migrations in North Carolina today. So to give you a sense, when we do these programs, the coalition uses something we call the arc of dialogue to try and help these conversations have a structure to them. And the arc of dialogue, you could think about it real quick of the way that you talk to somebody at a cocktail party. Okay? Usually if you just are meeting somebody at a party, you don't walk up to them and go, hey, so what do you think about immigration? By the way, what's your name? It's a tough place to start, right? What's your name? Where are you from? Right? That question we were talking about before. Then you start to learn a little bit more about them. Right? What do? You come here often? Right? You try and learn who this person is. You dive a little bit deeper into them. And then maybe after you do that for a while, oh, you're an ESL teacher. You start to learn about that a little bit. That turns into a conversation. Who are you teaching? What are the groups? How have you seen the groups change over the years who are coming to you as an ESL teacher? You start to have those larger conversations. And then, oh, it's been great to meet you. I need to go get cheese and wine or whatever it is that I need a drink. I'm going to go bring it. That same kind of conversation of personal conversation to big ideas to some kind of forward action, the next piece that's going to happen. That's how we structure these conversations. So for Levine, they ask you, describe a symbol or an image that represents where you're from as a way of starting to meet people after going through the exhibit. When did your family move to Charlotte? Why? Where in Charlotte do you encounter people different from you? Is the atmosphere in Charlotte welcoming of difference? These are questions we were kind of playing around. We're near some of these here tonight in Salem. It's getting to know you. Big picture. What are the benefits and the challenges of diversity to Charlotte? And at the end, they ask you to then think about that symbol that you drew at the start. Would you draw it differently? So Charlotte is all about, they're talking there in Charlotte about all the different ways and reasons that people have moved to Charlotte and their families have moved to Charlotte. And then how they are interacting across those barriers. That's what Levine wanted to talk about. That's where Charlotte was. If we were to go to the National Hispanic Cultural Center in Albuquerque, New Mexico, they're going to look at this a little bit different. The world's oriented a little bit differently there. They use, instead of an exhibit, they use something called the Mundos de Mestizaje, and I think, listening to folks, there are people who pronounce that much better than I will in the room, so afterwards, please correct. Which is a massive mural. It goes in here. It's larger than a football field. And they use that mural that looks at European and Central American and North American history as the place to start their questions. They go through that mural and they talk about what people see in the mural. They ask you what stands out in this mural. How does this make you feel? And then they get to some of the questions, because identity is very important there. Some of the questions we started to play with as well. Write down 5 adjectives that describe you. Now write down 5 adjectives that describe an American. How do they differ? What are those lines? Where do those things intersect? You can probably do this in your head right now. How would you answer about you? How would you answer about an American? And then they show this video. It is a clip of a boy named Sebastian de la Cruz. He dressed in mariachi attire, and he sang the national anthem during the 2013 NBA Finals when the San Antonio Spurs were in the NBA Finals. And he sang the U.S. anthem, Star Spangled Banner. And following that, there was an incredible outpouring on social media of deeply vitriolic comments about him, his outfit, and his right to be able to sing that song at that event. And so they share some of those comments and then start talking about those. Are these American comments? Why or why not are they American comments? And then stuff that we were talking about, balancing assimilation with preservation of culture. What are the benefits? Is one preferable? Asking questions deeply important to that museum and or that center and the communities that they serve. So those are a couple other models, right? This is going to look different. There's going to be places of overlap, but it should feel different depending on where you are. Ellis is different than Levine, is different than National Hispanic Cultural Center. This is immigration is a national conversation, but it's also a personal and a local conversation. So some of the things that we learned, a couple of the big pieces that we learned doing this work. One of the big ones, the line, America's a nation of immigrants, it doesn't start these conversations well. It's a really hard place to start these conversations because we found it made people equate the idea that all immigrant stories are the same isn't necessarily true. It left out people of Native descent. It often left out people of African American descent who didn't feel that they had an immigration story to the United States. And we also heard a lot from people that they either didn't consider themselves immigrants, their families had been here so long, that their ancestors' attitudes and experiences were fundamentally different than immigrants today, or that today was a unique time in American history that meant that these older experiences didn't apply to now. These are all things we heard. So we found this was a hard place to start conversations. It wasn't a productive way to ask these questions. What worked much better was to have conversations about defining the we of we the people. What does it mean to be American? What does American citizenship mean? Those questions, those conversations, similar to the one that we had tonight, were more productive. They were easier for people to get into. They were easier for people to learn from. Defining the process, talking about the legality was a place that was a positive entry point. Defining our land, borders, and freedom and movement was a conversation people were able to have. And defining who we protect. Having a civil liberties conversation around immigration was one that people were able to engage with. We found that branding around these matters, often saying, we are talking about immigration, was not the best way to pack people in a room. Sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't. You had to know your community. You had to know your audience. And the subset of that is finding your people. In every community, you're going to find the people who are interested in having this conversation and the folks that they can reach. Okay? And you guys were starting to talk about a lot of the different people who need to be at the table to have this conversation. Finding those folks in every community to bring all those people together to have conversations is going to be really important. The programs should be responsive. These conversations, immigration is an ongoing experience for America. Okay? Something starts happening in Europe, the conversation you want to be having shifts. Something happens on the border with Mexico, the conversation you want to be having shifts. Something happens on the border with Canada. Infectious disease breaks out in Africa. The conversation is always shifting. We want to be matching our conversations to where the country is and where our communities are. And last but not least, this is hard work. You guys did awesome tonight. You're great. Launching into this with a community, it's hard, it's scary, but people are doing it. You can do it. And so the outcomes we found, I didn't know if anybody would show up, but I was shocked that people came. How many people wanted to talk about this issue. Remember back to the start. There aren't other places in Salem or in New York or in Omaha to have this conversation, right? This is where, when these opportunities arise, people want to have these conversations. For us, these are two of the big outcomes for the way the coalition approaches this. This is the first time I heard someone different from me talk about their immigration experience. That's crucial. So much of how we learn about the world, we learn really well from other human beings. We learn well from their stories. Trying to understand the immigration experience in America just through media is difficult. It's really powerful when we can learn from other people, hear their points of view. And the flip side of that, the other outcome we want, this experience was valuable because I heard other people, but I started to understand my own stance on immigration better. We don't get a lot of self-reflective time for these big questions. So we can also, these programs can be a way of doing that too. We found that 80% of people said that our dialogues helped them see immigration from a new perspective, and 99% would recommend them to somebody else. So a lot of our sites, getting feedback like this, say this is work we want to continue, this is valuable work to us. We think this has been an effective program. So that's the National Dialogues on Immigration project. There is a website, Dialogues on Immigration. I might have actually just gotten that wrong, but if you type in National Dialogues on Immigration, it'll come up. It's the only one out there. I want to thank you guys for letting me talk with you today. I want to thank you for the amount of sharing that you did. And if you have questions about the project or anything that we did tonight, I'm happy to hear any of those. But thank you guys. Do you have questions?
Thank you very much.
Great.
Braden, I have a question about, do you want to talk a little bit about the funding that your organization does with the project grants?
Sure, if you do. So for members of the coalition, so sites that are members, we do grant funding to try and help that happen, or we'll work, like with this project, to get bigger grants to help support the different institutions that are doing this. Typically our internal grants, we grant to folks trying to do things that are exciting pilot projects that nobody else is willing to fund, and to people doing knowledge exchanges around the world. That's something we try and do a lot. We talked a lot right now about US sites. More than half our sites are in other countries in the world. So it becomes one of the great things about the coalition is people doing this work, being able to share that back and forth across different countries. There was one that we did a little while ago with a site, an immigration site in Italy, a site in Northwest Europe. The country is going out of my mind right now, that a lot of Italian immigrants went to, and then were minors there, and Ellis Island. So you've got these points of departure and then the points of arrival and the conversations around that, being able to have conversations across the ocean. It's good. Any other conversations? Do you have? You all right?
No, I'm fine.
Good. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.